¿Te imaginas un mar sin peces? Suena a ciencia ficción, pero podría suceder antes de que se den cuenta. ¿Sabías que 1 de cada 5 peces en el mundo es atrapado de forma ilegal? En muchos lugares, el ecosistema marino está tan alterado que ya amenaza la sostenibilidad de la pesca y cuanto aporta al suministro de alimentos de la raza humana. Y es difícil controlar una superficie más grande que todo Sudamérica en agua para cualquiera. Demostrarlo en el marco legal internacional y denunciarlo rápido, en mis aguas, es uno de los grandes retos a los que pocos se enfrentan cada día. Yo solo puedo ser naturalmente mar, pero quizás tú, ¿te imaginas? Avante, enfrenta el desafío.
Buenas tardes a todos, nuevamente les damos la bienvenida a Innovapolinav. Soy el capitán de corbeta Jorge Maldonado y les recuerdo que todos estos encuentros virtuales son posibles gracias al patrocinio del Gobierno Regional de Valparaíso y el soporte de Corfo con su programa de apoyo al entorno para el emprendimiento y la innovación. Seguiremos con ustedes todos los martes hasta el 1 de diciembre con distintos panelistas, donde hablaremos acerca de innovación abierta y los retos y potenciales soluciones asociados a mantener la vigilancia y el control sobre nuestro mar. La semana pasada realizamos el lanzamiento de Avante 2020, desafío de innovación abierta para cualquiera que desee ser parte de la solución de distintos problemas de la Armada relacionados a la inmensidad de nuestro mar y al mismo tiempo generar emprendimientos con orientación dual. Después de la inauguración del desafío, donde contamos con las palabras del señor ministro de Ciencia y Tecnología, tuvimos la oportunidad de escuchar la exposición de Peter Newell respecto de cómo los emprendimientos son dirigidos por la misión. Si no pudieron estar presentes o les gustaría volver a ver la inauguración o cualquiera de las conferencias que ya se hayan realizado, pueden acceder a nuestra página web www.innovapolinav.cl. Ahí encontrarán en nuestra sala de prensa, donde estamos dejando todas las conferencias disponibles para que las puedan volver a revisar. Y ya entrando de lleno en materia del día de hoy, el webinar que tenemos el día de hoy nos va a hablar de cómo muchas innovaciones disruptivas, pese a su enorme potencial y optimismo, sufren del retraso en su creación de valor o incluso llegan a fracasar en la creación de valor. Rahul Kapoor nos hablará de cómo este fenómeno debe enfrentarse en 3 tipos de incertezas, una desde el ambiente tecnológico, de ecosistema y del modelo de negocio. Rahul Kapoor es profesor de administración de la Wharton School de la Universidad de Pensilvania y actualmente es el presidente de la División de Gestión de Tecnología e Innovación de la Academia de Gestión. En Wharton, Rahul imparte cursos de pregrado, MBA, Executive MBA y doctorado en Tecnología y Estrategias de Innovación. También es un colaborador activo de la educación ejecutiva de Wharton y enseñando en los programas de inscripción personalizada y abierta. Ha recibido varios premios por su investigación y enseñanza, incluido el Premio Académico Emergente de la Academia de Gestión. También ha asesorado a varias empresas con respecto al lanzamiento de nuevas iniciativas de innovación. Antes de unirse a la academia, pasó más de 7 años en la industria de alta tecnología, donde trabajó para Texas Instruments, conocida por todos los ingenieros por las calculadoras, ¿cierto? Y estuvo involucrado con 2 nuevas empresas, dentro de las cuales en una fue el fundador. Además, el día de hoy vamos a contar con la compañía de Ellen Chang, que ya algunos que nos han seguido durante varios capítulos de estos webinars la vieron trabajar con nosotros en el panel de expertos, quien nos va a ayudar hoy día en una conversación con Rahul Kapoor. Así es que los invito a todos a ver este webinar. Les recordamos que tenemos traducción simultánea, porque el webinar es en inglés, así que abajo a la derecha pueden encontrar el icono con la forma del planeta y pueden optar por el idioma que desean escuchar la conferencia. Y además pueden enviarnos sus preguntas a través del chat para que nosotros las dirijamos hacia Ellen para que se las hagamos a Rahul Kapoor. Así es que bienvenido a nuestro 10º webinar. Good afternoon, Helen. Good afternoon, Rahul. I already did a little bit of the introduction of Rahul, but I will let you start with the webinar for today, Ellen. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much. And welcome everyone to our conversation here today about the uncertainty in innovation, which Professor Rahul Kapoor has done extensive study to take a look at the drivers of uncertainty and how to think about it, providing hopefully that today we'll learn about frameworks and how to think about this uncertainty, because innovation, while inherently exciting, also can be challenging, and we can basically prepare ourselves to be successful. Before I hand it over to Professor Kapoor, I just wanted to let you know that I work closely with the Chilean Navy, with the U.S. Navy, which we have a partnership with the Chilean Navy to launch innovation challenges here in the Chilean country, basically the nation of Chile. And so we hope to make a success, help the country be successful. So with that, though, let me turn it over to Professor Kapoor. Would you give us a sense of your background, your research, and how you came to Wharton, and even give us a little sense of your work with Argentina and Chile?
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Jorge, and thank you to all of you who are here for the webinar. It's a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to share some of my research on this important topic of innovation with you this afternoon. I've been in the innovation domain for more than 25 years. As Jorge said, my first job was an engineer in a company called Texas Instruments. You remember the calculators, of course. I was in the semiconductor side of Texas Instruments, making computer chips. And then I became an R&D manager and then an entrepreneur. And for the last 12 years, I've been a professor studying innovation, studying how innovation can both disrupt industries, but also create a sustainable model of economic growth. And much of what I have done my research on over the last 12 years here at the Wharton School, I've taught MBAs, I've taught executives to how to create value from innovations. And as Ellen, you said, I've also had a chance to experience firsthand the innovation landscape in Latin America, primarily through Argentina and Chile, companies like Mercado Libre and Satellogic in Argentina, very innovative companies in very different domains, and Startup Chile in Chile, an organization that really excels in inculcating and incubating the entrepreneurial and innovation energy in Latin America. So I'm excited to be here. It's an important topic. I think Chile, from my experience, has enormous innovative talent and opportunities. And I'm hoping this session would help to realize some of those opportunities as it relates to innovation and disruptive growth.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm going to move to the paper that you recently wrote for MIT Sloan, and you talk about innovation uncertainty. How did you come to choose this as a topic? What were some of the drivers that led you to study this?
Yes, and I hope everyone got a chance to look at that paper. It's a paper that took me almost 10 years to write. And it really required me to study many different companies and many different industries to present a framework that I laid out in that paper. And so it's really a synthesis of a number of research papers I've written looking at innovation in the electronics sector, in the energy sector, in the healthcare sector. And through all those papers and looking at hundreds of companies, thousands of technologies and innovation over 30, 40, 50 years, there was one overarching finding. And that was that companies, both large and small, young and old, do come up with great disruptive ideas. They do invest in many new emerging technologies like blockchain, like artificial intelligence, like autonomous driving, like solar energy, a myriad of other examples. But despite coming up with these disruptive ideas and investing in these new emerging technologies, they failed to create value from those ideas and those technologies. And so it was a real paradox for me to look at that while innovators are successful in terms of innovating, but not successful in terms of creating value from those innovations. And so this article was my attempt with my colleague Thomas Kluter, who was a PhD student at Wharton and now a professor at ESA in Barcelona. And we put a framework that much of the thinking around disruption was focused around how you can threaten the established industry and firms and how it presents opportunities for startups. And the mantra was how to disrupt. And the mantra was either you disrupt yourself or be disrupted. But what the article talks about is this other side of disruption, which is the one that we often don't hear or talk much about, which is that the path towards disruption is full of uncertainty. And without an explicit consideration of the different sources of uncertainty, most disruptive innovations fail to realize potential, results in wasted resources and missed opportunities for both startups and oftentimes established firms as well.
When you mentioned value, you said what you just said makes me think innovation activity may not equal value. It's kind of like my equation. So when you say value, what type of value are you talking about? Is it resolving to financial value, or is it a broader context that you're talking about there?
Great point. You know, when I think about innovation, I talk about two different types of economic considerations. One is creating value, which is you're solving a specific problem, or the innovation is doing a specific job, and that helps to create some benefit for the user or for the society. So the value creation part is really how the innovation benefits the specific user or the product market fit, if you will. And then value capture is, can the innovator actually generate profits from the innovation? And this article looks at value from both sides. It looks at value from a creation side and a capture side as well.
Ah, interesting. So as would then the uncertainty factors that you mentioned be part and reside within creation as well as the capture? Or could you help us unpack that?
Yes, absolutely, and that's a great question. And you know, as in the article, I talk about disruption and uncertainty are two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So every innovation that's trying to disrupt an existing order, whether it's a market or an industry, also faces uncertainty on the other side. And in the article, we talk about three types of uncertainties every innovation faces. The first is around the technology and the user, which very much relates to value creation, which is if the technology doesn't meet the performance or the cost for the user to adopt the technology, there is no value being created by the new technology or the new innovation. The second type of uncertainty comes from the ecosystem. So even if you have the innovation, even if you have the technology, think about electric car or an autonomous plane, you can have a really good technology, a real good innovation, but if you don't have the supporting ecosystem, like charging infrastructure for electric car or the battery technology for electric car as well, there is not going to be value that gets created in the customers. You know, for me, Apple is a great example of a company that really manage the ecosystem uncertainty through their app ecosystem and ensuring that customers benefit from the iPhone by bringing in the whole ecosystem together. And today, Tesla is doing pretty much the same thing with electric cars. It's not just building a good technology, having high performance and lower cost over time, but also resolving the ecosystem uncertainty in terms of charging infrastructure. So those two types of uncertainty, technology and ecosystem, are central to value creation. The third type of uncertainty, which we refer to in the article, is the business model design, which fundamentally gets to value capture and monetization. And many times, innovations do a great job in finding market and getting a good market share, but find it hard to actually generate economic rents for the innovators in terms of profits and returns on investments. So the three factors we talk about in the article in terms of uncertainty, the first two are much more central to value creation, whereas the business model design is much more central to value capture.
Interesting. I'm going to hit value creation in a bit, but what you just said about taking market share, generating product market fit, getting market share, yet not actually realizing value or economic rents. Could you give us an example of that? And what happens to those types of innovations or companies?
Yeah, one of my favorite examples is a company that was started maybe about 10 years ago called MakerBot. It's a 3D printing company. It tried to make a 3D printer for home use, and it built its own ecosystem. It got a lot of other companies to allow for 3D printed objects for a variety of users, but couldn't find a way to make money off 3D printing. And the business model initially was an open source business model, which is if you want to work on the design, you can work on the design and improvise it without MakerBot benefiting from it as part of the open source. Now that business model generated enormous value in terms of letting more and more businesses leveraging the MakerBot architecture, but made it very difficult for MakerBot to actually profit from those innovations as well. A more recent example is a company called Better Place, which was founded in Israel and had a very disruptive idea of how to increase the adoption of electric cars through the battery swapping station. So instead of a customer paying for the electric car, and where battery is the big part of the cost for the electric car, Better Place would take the cost of the battery away from the customer and offer a battery swapping network service around it. It was a great idea. And it really got a lot of attention, a lot of the funding at the time, but the economics of creating a charging infrastructure and getting customers to pay a subscription were just not enough to generate an economic surplus for the next round of investment and the next round of innovation.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I feel those types of examples could be a timing issue. I'm curious your thoughts there, because there was Webvan back in the 1990s that was started by a set of consultants out of Accenture, and they were basically doing grocery delivery. And they raised, $500 million back in 1990 days. But ultimately, they ended up going bankrupt. Yet today we have Amazon doing grocery delivery. We have Walmart starting to, open up their own membership. We have just individual grocery chains actually doing grocery delivery. I'm curious your thinking there. Could it be a timing issue sometimes?
Yes and no. When it comes to new technologies, new breakthrough ideas, one could argue that significant part of uncertainty gets resolved over time. And so if you give something more time, people would find out more possibilities, there would have been more experimentation, and you have a much more narrow set of possibilities to work with. And so you get into a world of somewhat lower uncertainty. I think that has both the positive and the negative aspects. The positive aspect is, yes, if you are a fast follower or a fast second mover, as sometimes it's referred to, it gets you to learn from what others have done and not try to make those same mistakes. But at the same time, it also takes time away from you to create your own asset base, to create your own value proposition. If you look at many of the businesses today, platform-based businesses like Facebook, like Uber, like Airbnb, like Amazon to a certain extent, right? Amazon took on the hit earlier on by being a first mover or early mover in creating an e-commerce, Facebook in creating a social media network. So I think from my perspective, waiting for the uncertainty to resolve could lower the risk in terms of the know-how that you need to create value from the innovation, but it also opens the possibility that somebody else might do the same and you may lose a competitive advantage, especially in innovative environments where moving early can give you a significant advantage in terms of branding, in terms of network effects, in terms of learning, and really putting a stake in the ground that just like what Tesla did, that we are the ones who believe in this innovation and we are the brand that you should associate with this disruption.
Interesting. That's a really good framework to think through or use to think about. I'm going to move over to the two areas that hit upon value creation. So you talk about technology and ecosystems, and I'm curious about technology. Depending on what you're trying to do, there's different technologies that are being commercialized, if you will, or maybe the science is becoming something that can be engineered and therefore readily used inside products. And I feel that depending on the domain or the industry sector, the technology cycles are slower and faster. Does that speed of the technology cycle or product life cycle impact these uncertainties or add to it, at least based on your research?
Yeah, I think there is definitely variation in terms of different sectors and different types of technologies in terms of how quickly they're changing. Of course, what drives change are typically investments and how much investments are going into these sectors. So today, we know there's a lot of investment in technologies like blockchain, artificial intelligence, and self-driving technology. And so you see a significant acceleration in terms of rate of progress in those technologies over the last 5-10 years. Other technologies, and I'll use the one, Ellen, that you are very familiar with, in technologies like aerospace. And one could argue that, for more than 50, 60 years, there hasn't been a significant breakthrough in any new technology in that space. Is it because there was not enough opportunity for improvement, or there wasn't enough effort for those improvements to be shown? And I do think that the answer lies to both of those issues. I think you need both efforts by a variety of players in the ecosystem, small, large firms, government agencies, to support innovation. And at the same time, there are certain technologies that could present more opportunities for innovation than others. And that could be a function of the physical limits that those technologies may be subjected to.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, thanks for that. We actually have a question from the audience, and I'll read it out. In your view, how is it that the three uncertainty factors play their role on an innovation effort that targets the public domain? Would it be the same? Would it be different?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to be a little clearer in terms of what the public domain means. But if I think about public domain as in public agencies, doing public research. For example, the example that I know, U.S. Department of Defense, DARPA, their research arm, and DARPA has been critical to many of the technologies that we are using today in the US or in the midst of adopting in the US. Of course, the most famous one now people are talking about is the self-driving car. And it was the grand challenge by DARPA that really accelerated a lot of the development. And if you take that as an example, it's quite clear that any public funded research that is addressing a public use was subject to all three types of uncertainty. There is technology uncertainty in terms of what amount of resources and what technological solutions would take for the customers to be able to use self-driving cars. There is ecosystem uncertainty in terms of standards and wireless connections and sensors and AI that needs to be developed for the self-driving cars to be utilized more broadly. And then there's a business model uncertainty. If we shift from a model of owning vehicles to using vehicles across the economy, then the business model of car ownership would have to give way to something like operating fleets or operating mobility as a service, which presents significant uncertainty in terms of how the economics are going to play out. So I think any innovation that's targeted either in the private domain or in the public domain, I strongly believe that, that those three factors are important considerations for the innovators. Now, my suggestion in the article is not so much to say that all three, the technology, the ecosystem, and the business model uncertainties need to be high. For some innovations, those uncertainties could be very low. So if you think about blockchain as a technology, and you think about finance versus supply chain use or healthcare, blockchain can be used in many different applications. One could argue that the ecosystem uncertainty in finance for blockchain is perhaps lower than the ecosystem uncertainty in supply chain. So what I like about that framework is the framework helps you to systematically evaluate the different bottlenecks that any innovation may be subject to as it's trying to make its way through the market, but at the same time, preserve some flexibility that not every application, not every use case would be subject to the same sources of uncertainty. And that's something we saw, Thomas and I, my co-author in this paper, very clearly in the healthcare space. Some innovation had high business model uncertainty, and some actually had low business model uncertainty.
Interesting. So as we use this framework, you talk about, I often use questions to try to tease out how with this uncertainty. You talk about 5 questions that should be asked. How would you help us operationalize, those questions in the evaluation framework that you've provided here?
Yeah, so I think those 5 questions are essentially ways to get a strategic mindset around any innovation opportunity. And that mindset needs to recognize not only the disruptive potential, but also the risk that these disruptive innovations could confront as they move from idea to commercialization. So, the first part of the exercise is very much to think about what's the value proposition of the innovation, and thinking about the different types of applications that the innovation could be used for. So think about artificial intelligence. You can use a wide array of applications in business, wide array of applications in consumer as well. And then you do this assessment in terms of uncertainty. Now, Ellen, your point is a very good one, which is to suggest, how do you know if uncertainty is high or low? And so the way I do this exercise with my students here at Wharton is to ask, why would a customer or a user of that new innovation would use that innovation, right? And so if you think about Apple and iPhone, you would say, well, people would use and pay almost $1,000 for an iPhone if they can do more with it than just talking to people or texting to people. And so if you're going to create a use case where it requires lots of other applications besides just talking on the phone and messaging people, then you have to ask, do those other elements exist in the world today? If they exist in the world today, then uncertainty is low. Then the use case would get realized. But if, and I'll use the phrase that you're very familiar with, if you think about the minimal viability of that innovation is somehow under risk because these other elements are not lined up, then I push the uncertainty higher, right? So I think of uncertainty in terms of high and low. I think that's pretty much how I would think about, rather than having a very complex continuum. And uncertainty is low when the innovation can plug and play into an existing infrastructure, ecosystem, use case, at least as a minimal viable product. Uncertainty is high when the innovation cannot plug and play into an existing system, and new innovations in ecosystems or investments in ecosystems or business model or technologies would have to be done for that basic minimal viability to be established.
Interesting. What you just said brings to mind possibly where some public institutions sit, but also on the policy side, because if you're in policy or if you're a public institution or public domain and you understand how a technology is trying to engage with that domain, perhaps you figure out how to reduce the uncertainty, or you figure out how to reconfigure that organization to accept it. I will bring, here's a tangible example. We do know that larger companies or some industries or many industries are going through digital transformation. And I feel that an organization, in order to go through that transformation, needs to readjust its own infrastructure. I mean, am I touching upon it, or am I like way off? Could you comment there?
No, absolutely. I think, the whole point of the framework is not to suggest that all sources of uncertainty lie outside the organization. In fact, oftentimes the sources of uncertainty exist within the organization. So if you're pursuing an innovation that is part of the digital transformation of the organization, I think the business model is a big part of the internal challenge that many companies face. I remember Microsoft 10 years ago was going through this digital transformation in the marketplace for them as they shift from on-premise software to a cloud-based service. And it really required them to think inside the organization in terms of how they incentivize teams, what kind of culture they create. And so I think, as you rightly pointed out, that when it comes to the business model uncertainty, it often resides inside the organization, and it's often entrenched in past practices and past sources of value, which may not hold as you move on to this new industry landscape.
Yeah, what comes to mind is some of my work, the Navy, where it's really a lot of the practices are around the industrial, still stem from the industrial age, and how it's struggling to move into the digital age, where information and data have tremendous value. We're trying to leverage artificial intelligence and all of this, it's great technology, a lot of excitement around the technology, but as you stated, the ecosystem has to start to shift. Who knows where the business models are, because at least on the government side, the contracting tends to be of a certain type for hardware, whereas certain types of technologies aren't conducive to that. And I bring that up because we're talking to a maritime or a Navy audience, which might be struggling with some of the similar issues.
I would say, the issue that you brought up, Ellen, is an issue that, I normally refer to it in my classroom as the Kodak Problem.
Yeah.
Right. A company that was successful for more than 100 years, a real innovator back in the day in terms of chemical films, black and white, color, camera, a business model innovator as well, right? Kodak was a pioneer in terms of the idea of the razor blade as a way to monetize an innovation. So what Kodak represents is fairly typical of many established organizations, is that they were extremely innovative, and they found a formula in terms of technology, in terms of ecosystem, in terms of business model that generated enormous value for a long time. And as you shifted from the old landscape to the new landscape, for example, it's AI with digital transformation from Kodak Chemical to digital photography, it often questions those foundations in terms of your business model, in terms of your ecosystem, in terms of your technology and the minimal viable product for new innovation. And so, as much as disruption is an aspiration to innovate and grow, when it comes to the context of more established organization, it should be an aspiration to renew their existing ecosystems and renew their business models as well. So I think when we talk about startups, innovation tends to be primarily new ideas, breakthrough ideas. When you talk about established organizations, whether it's public or private, innovation should be tied to the exercise of renewal and renewing your ecosystem and renewing your business models. And we know those renewal processes are extremely difficult the larger, the more complex the organizations are.
Yeah, I think what you said about 3 or 4 minutes ago led me, spurred this thought, because jobs and titles have to change. And that's hard because all of a sudden people have uncertainty around their role in an organization, and there's a little bit of resistance. I mention that because even as we move into the digital age, perhaps there's different types of titles that go along with that.
Yeah, and for me, I agree that the nature of jobs and the nature of tasks would have to change, and the titles could follow that as well. But I have always found any discussion of disruption to be more useful if it is framed as an opportunity than as a threat. Mm-hmm. And I think once you can structure the conversation across the organization, not just at the top, that this is not a threat. This is an opportunity. We are uniquely positioned to take advantage of this opportunity. And this is essentially what Satya Nadella has done for Microsoft. Mm-hmm. Like, Microsoft hasn't created a completely new genie out of the hat in terms of new innovations in the last 10 years. It's essentially repackaged a lot of its offers and organization to take advantage of this new landscape around cloud and artificial intelligence. And so I think, many people 10 years ago, including myself, thought Microsoft was going in the direction of Kodak. But under new leadership, in a very short amount of time, today it's much more valuable than it's ever been in its history. Yeah,
I agree.
And so I think for me, going back to the public agency and the Chilean Navy as a very good example, I find that clearly the efforts of disruption need to be tied to the efforts of renewal in terms of organizational renewal, in terms of culture, in terms of processes, in terms of incentives. At the same time, I think there is the public agencies, especially mission-oriented agencies, Ellen, as you know very well, are uniquely positioned to do what many of the private entities cannot do, which is make big investments in technologies at a very early stage that no startup or established firm could actually invest in. So if you look at what Department of Energy is doing in the US through the ARPA-E initiative, or what DARPA has been doing for many years, is some of the critical disruptive technologies and critical investments in the early stage of technologies that typically made by the public sector, and especially with mission-oriented agencies looking for a specific use cases of those technologies. So I think from my perspective, public organizations like the Chilean Navy should really think about what's their unique value add in the technology and the innovation landscape. And for me, the value add is much more convincing in emerging technologies that are still very early stage, where no startup could invest the resources, no VC would want to put their money in. But if they can be improved, they can generate enormous value for society. I'm just thinking about technologies in energy, many of the green tech in energy. I'm thinking about urban air mobility, and in terms of VTOLs and eVTOLs and others that you know very well. They need enormous investments, but for a startup or for an existing aerospace company that have their own profits to worry about, it's extremely unlikely that they would be able to make those investments. So I do think public mission-oriented agencies can play a very critical role in pushing some of these early stage disruptive technologies towards commercialization.
Mm-hmm. I think you make a good point. Even what I see sometimes is these organizations can also act as early test beds, which burns down the technical risk, possibly helps a company or a new technology figure out how it should be delivered, which helps with a little bit of possibly the delivery model, if not the business model.
Absolutely. And I think the classic example for me today is the DARPA Grand Challenge for autonomous vehicles. if not for those challenges, we would not have had Waymo or Tesla in the US make so much progress in the self-driving technology.
Yeah, that was quite a challenge that DARPA actually implemented that 10 years ago, I guess.
Yeah.
Here's a question oriented towards Chile and the Chilean ecosystem itself. What would be your comments for Chile regarding the three uncertainty factors? I mean, does the landscape matter? Does the location matter? Is it, how developed the country, or maybe its capabilities? How would you characterize that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as I've traveled around the world trying to study different regions, and in terms of the opportunities and constraints, in terms of innovation, I think each region has its unique aspects, and if you take my framework from the article around technology issues, the business model issues, and ecosystem issues, I would encourage, and again, I don't have the specific details about Chile, but any region to evaluate which sectors they excel in terms of human capital, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of use cases. So, for example, the example I like to use is country like Singapore, which doesn't have a lot of natural resources, doesn't have a lot of land, has a very limited market, but it has really found 2 or 3 sectors that it has focused on to create this vibrant ecosystem with a lot of experimentation in terms of business models and technologies. Biotechnology is one sector, energy is the other sector, and today they're moving into robotics and automation as the third sector. So I think from my perspective, whether it's Chile or Singapore, it's really important to ask in terms of what's the core human capital we have within our country, which sectors that human capital can be deployed in, and then using those sectors as a way to push the innovation agenda forward.
Yeah, thank you for that framework. Here's another question. Is there a set of common mental attitudes in different societies that make them prone to accept or adapt new innovations?
That's a very interesting question. Mental attitudes. So the only, and I would be a little bit more speculative here. As a professor, I always like to be careful in terms of what I say. I would like to say most things based on what I found through research and facts, as opposed to what I think might be the case. This is more along the lines of what I think, but I do have some facts to support that. And so I've been doing some research on forecasting and looking at what kind of mental models help generate superior forecast around innovation and new technology. So all of us in the innovation space have some forecast or assumptions about when we might see self-driving cars, when we might see artificial intelligence broadly applied to the consumers, when we might see robots around us to do a variety of different tasks. And so what I found in that research is that people who tend to have an open mind in terms of possibilities and then scan for information as ways to experiment the possibilities. So almost a experimentation in your mind as opposed to experimentation in the real world, and using data to falsify the possibilities, they tend to generate much more accurate forecast and much more accurate view of the future. So I think going back to the mental attitude, if I were to say 2 key aspects of the mental attitude, one is openness to different possibilities, and the second is to pay attention to information around you and test which of those possibilities are more likely to take place, as opposed to drawing on your hunch or your gut feelings.
Interesting. So if I were to turn that a little bit into looking back at this framework that we're talking about around uncertainty, I like to characterize perhaps uncertainty management. Have you had success in, or looking at companies in their cultures, have they been able to possibly model uncertainties in their minds and forecast potentially mitigations? I love mitigation against risk.
Yes. No, it's great. And Ellen, as you know, you've been part of an organization that really has introduced one of the best practices of what innovators can use in terms of managing uncertainty, which is the broader lean startup movement and the importance of experimentation. So I think experimentation in a way that thinks through what's the minimal viable product, what are the use cases, and having a very structured approach to experimentation is clearly one way of mitigating many of these uncertainties. Now, the ecosystem uncertainties are a little bit more difficult to deal with through experimentation, but the business model and the technology uncertainties, which is really about product market fit, they tend to be very well managed through experimentation. There are other ways that companies have successfully mitigated some of these risks. Ellen, as you were referring to, the real options approach is another approach that I see used quite effectively. So instead of making $1 billion acquisition to invest in a new technology, you make small incremental investments, but you diversify those investments into many different initiatives to manage the uncertainty around that technology or use case. The third approach that I'm becoming increasingly a fan of is this partnership model between startups and established organizations. I do think both of these organizations have certain strengths and certain weaknesses. So startups are extremely good in terms of experimentation and agility, but they tend to be constrained in terms of resources and creating their whole ecosystem in a short enough time. Established firms, on the other hand, have to struggle with all these change initiatives that we're talking about. They're not as agile. It's difficult to do big experiments in an established firm, but they have significant resources and often relationships in an ecosystem that could be very beneficial as well. So I have found many companies through my research who have taken this partnership model where they work with startups as established firms, or startups work with established firms to both share the risk around the uncertainties, but also leverage each other's strengths to create value from a disruptive innovation offer. And you see that today with companies like Google, with companies like Apple, with even companies like Tesla, that the partnership model between startups and established firms is really helping drive a lot of disruption through.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have just about 5 minutes left, but I want to revisit what you just said about partnerships. And I'm wondering if you could give us maybe specific examples of why, who, I don't know if you can say who, but examples of why it works. Like, what was the startup doing? Or I'm maybe actually a little bit more interested in a larger organization, because I do see several companies out there have innovation outposts or initiatives. And I'm curious if you see a variation on the success. Are they creating value for that organization?
Yeah, I'll be careful not to single out one organization,
absolutely.
Given there are many organizations who are really pursuing this in a very sophisticated manner. I would say the companies that I have found that tend to do a better job in the established organization, as you said, they tend to have a dedicated organizational design around these partnerships. So instead of linking these partnerships in an existing business, so think about a pharmaceutical company, doing research on new pharmaceuticals. And they're moving into personalized medicine as a completely new innovative approach in the pharmaceutical sector. Instead of letting existing businesses partner with startups on personalized medicine, they will create a dedicated group around personalized medicine, bringing in people from different business lines and technology domains, but then find partnerships to work. And one key aspect of the partnership model that I'm a big fan of, and partnership is not just a a contract for these companies to work together, but it's also an agreement that all decisions are made jointly. Mm-hmm. And if the decisions are mostly being made by the established firm and the innovation takes place by the startup, that is a recipe that is designed for failure, in my view.
Yeah, it's unbalanced and probably lose the momentum and the motivation.
Exactly.
We have just one more question, I think, or time for one more question. Have you thought about a systematic approach or methodology for addressing the 3 uncertainty factors in order to identify the important issues in each one of them? Do you look at ecosystem and is there a ranking of sorts, or the technology or the business model, I think is how the question.
Yeah, I mean, that's again a very important, relevant question. Unfortunately, it requires a very complex answer, and that's why it's not something you can put together in a paper. And the reason it's a very complex answer is because it's just so many factors, and each organization is so different, as Ellen, as you know very well. So once you think about differences in terms of organization, differences in terms of industries, differences in terms of technologies, it's very hard to create a framework that applies for everybody, right? So when I work with companies or executives, I would typically try to understand everything from the technology to the use cases to the business models, and then we'll ideate in terms of which are the things that tend to be less clear around the technology, which are the things that tend to be less clear around business model, which are the things that tend to be less clear around the ecosystem, and then start evaluating each of those 3 factors together. So what you do with technology could impact ecosystem, could impact the business model. What you do with business model could impact technology. So it often takes 1 to 2 days of extensive engagement with a specific company or a technology to understand the different sources of uncertainty, and then have a process to manage it strategically. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a simple framework, but the article is a starting point for you to embrace that every innovation comes with this process of uncertainty, and your success is not just about how exciting the innovation is, but more importantly, how you navigate uncertainty around the innovation.
I would like to tie your answer back to what you had brought up before, which is a systematic approach could be pulled together through kind of the lean startup experimentation model. If an organization understands and starts to think about it that way and starts pulling different levers over time, they'll get a better sense of, what trade-offs they have to make, is kind of how I would see it.
Absolutely. And in the article, we mentioned it, I've written a longer article that explicitly talks about how we could link lean startups and experimentation with the framework. And I think it's the combination of these ideas that could generate a lot more successful innovation strategy than focusing on just one or the other.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Well, I think we're going to wrap up from here. So Professor Kapoor, thank you so very much for joining us. Jorge, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Here I am.
Yes.
Ellen and Rahul, thank you very much for your amazing presentation and conversation, discussion. We've been able to listening to all the questions that we have and the people made on the presentation. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Ellen, for being part of our team. Rahul said many times that it's a key factor to make the right choice with your partnerships. And BM&T has been our partner for a long time already. So thank you, Ellen, for being part of our team. And if you let me go to Spanish now.
Please.
Que hayan disfrutado la presentación y los dejamos a todos cordialmente invitados para seguirnos en nuestras redes sociales y a que asistan el próximo martes 20 de octubre en este mismo horario, donde tendremos a Javier Ramírez, que es el director ejecutivo de Know-How Chile, otro de nuestros partners que están trabajando estrechamente con nosotros, y ellos nos hablará de la innovación y el emprendimiento en la Armada. ¿Se puede? ese es el tema de la presentación. O sea, ¿qué más relacionado con lo que hemos estado hablando? En este tema, Javier nos hablará de cómo nuestra institución busca resolver problemas específicos a través de emprendimientos de base científico-tecnológico que luego tengan la oportunidad de convertirse en proveedores de la defensa. Inscríbanse en www.innovapolinav.cl, donde podrán revisar con más detalle las próximas conferencias. Nos vemos el próximo martes. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Dr. Rahul. Y los dejamos con un video motivante de Maritime Domain Awareness para que se vayan inyectando de energía y participen de este desafío. Muchas gracias y nos vemos el próximo martes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Soy vida, desde antes de que existiera la propia vida. Soy fuerza, y rujo desde las entrañas de la misma tierra. Soy quien se rompe, quien estalla, quien se postra ante ti, quien estuvo antes de que tú llegaras, y quien estará cuando te marches. Soy quien conocerá a tus hijos, y a los hijos de tus hijos, quien les marcará el rumbo. Soy quien les mostrará los espacios eternos y las líneas infinitas allá en el horizonte. Soy el aire que respiras, el sol que ciega tus ojos, la brisa que te roza en la piel. Soy el poder de alimentarte, de transportarte, de proveerte de futuro. Soy todo lo que esperas que sea. Y aún soy más. Ocupo tanta superficie del planeta que no serías capaz de imaginar. Y albergo tanta nueva vida, nuevas especies animales y ecosistemas que no alcanzarías a comprender. Estoy en las 2/3 partes del mundo en el que habitas. Soy la inmensidad que no puede calcularse. Soy tu mayor grandeza. Y estoy aquí por ti, desde antes que tú llegaras. Y seguiré aquí después de que te marches, si es que lo permites. Soy tu desafío, el de salvarme y velar por mí. El de vigilarme, controlarme y mantenerte alerta. El de protegerme y prevenirte. El de luchar por mí. Soy el desafío de que me salves, para salvarte tú. ¿Te importo? ¿Te importa el mar que tranquilo baña tus costas? He venido a desafiarte, a pedirte que des un paso al frente y formes parte, porque soy tu mayor grandeza. Y estoy aquí por ti. ¿Y tú? Avante, enfrenta el desafío.